Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Robert Hannigan is the former director of the British Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ, and founder of its National Cybersecurity Centre. He's also the author of the recent book, Counterintelligence: What the Secret World Can Teach Us About Problem Solving and Creativity. The book is filled with stories about the legendary codebreakers at Bletchley Park, and it also offers insights for individuals and organisations with an interest in puzzle solving, ingenuity, and better ways of working. True Spies producer Morgan Child sat down with Robert to hear about what Bletchley Park got right and what that means for the rest of us.
Robert, it is an honor to have you here. Thank you. I have heard you describe your book as being born out of a time when there was a lack of optimism in terms of politics and economics. Can you tell me about that and why you chose to write the book when you did?
Well, it's great to be with you, Morgan. Yeah, you're right. I was writing it in the pandemic and there wasn't much optimism around. I can't say there's a lot more now, to be honest. It's still a tough time, isn't it? But I was very interested in problem solving and how did previous generations, particularly in the intelligence community where I spent much of my life, how did they solve problems? And I've spent a lot of time at Bletchley Park, which was the great sort of code-breaking centre in the Second World War. So I thought I could write a little bit about that and explore, how did they solve these big problems? And then also draw on my experience in GCHQ, so our signals intelligence agency and cyber agency here, and try and draw out some lessons. And it was as simple as that, really, to sort of how do we approach big problems in the future?
And you served as director of GCHQ from 2014 until 2017, is that right?
That's right, yeah. And I'd been in and out of the intelligence community for quite a while before that, so in various jobs in government, yeah.
And you open the book by sort of setting the scene for us, in terms of what Britain's biggest security concerns were in 2014. So you talk about a rise in cyber attacks, about ISIS, about Russia, which had recently invaded Crimea. And yet you chose in those very first days in that position to talk to your organization about Bletchley Park, which is, of course, the code-breaking headquarters that ultimately became the Government Code and Cipher School, or GCNCS, which is now GCHQ. Why did you make that decision to go back to the very start of the story?
So I think one of the things that makes intelligence work, and particularly leading an agency, so interesting is you're dealing with two timelines. So you've got the firefighting, if you like, that's going on now, all the problems you're facing, and we might come back to that. Some of them haven't changed since I was writing Russia and terrorism and other big problems. But you're also trying to look ahead in the sort of 10, 20, 30, 40-year timeline and say, so what are the technologies that may be misused in the future? And that's why I went back to Bletchley, partly because that's the kind of the spiritual home for GCHQ. That was our greatest achievement. People like Alan Turing was our most famous employee, the father of artificial intelligence. So we draw a lot of comfort from that history and a lot of inspiration, a lot of hope for the future. But also I think there are some practical lessons. So how did they approach these really difficult problems? Because we always tend to think that the problems, like the ones you've just described, are worse than anyone's faced before. But actually, of course, you look back into history and you think they had some pretty tough challenges too. So that's why I started there, I guess.
And you write also early on that you learned that most of the country and most of the readers of this book, I'm quoting you, have aptitude for this work. What sort of aptitude are you referring to?
Well, I think puzzling is something that GCHQ has become quite famous for. In my first year, I sent out a Christmas card and we also put it online. and we got our cryptographers to do a special puzzle in it. They do that all the time anyway for fun, and they did it every year privately. But we thought, let's put it out there and let the public have a go at it. And we were just amazed that without any real marketing or publicity, about 600,000 people had a go at this around the world. And it was a very, very difficult challenge in about 6 stages, and you had to go through each stage. And a handful got to the final stage, and we gave them, a very, very low-cost gift as a prize, being government. But one of the things it revealed, and in all the puzzling we then did, and we published a puzzle book then, which was a huge bestseller in the UK and overseas too. And what we discovered was that everybody loves puzzles. So most of the population you see on the bus or the metro in the morning, they're all doing Sudoku or crosswords, or they're on their phone doing puzzles. People love puzzles, and there are all sorts of complex reasons for that. But it does suggest that there's a lot of aptitude out there for the kind of puzzle-solving work that is particular to intelligence.
And all sorts of different people love puzzles, right? This is an important component of your book.
Exactly. I mean, it's open to everyone and anyone. And I think the key, and I suppose one of the big themes, both for Bletchley and GCHQ and for the book, is to crack really difficult problems, you need a mixture of people. So you need a mixture of approaches, different ways of thinking, which we now call neurodiversity. Back in Bletchley, they probably saw it as eccentricity, and there were some real eccentrics there. But you need different ways of looking at that problem. You need different kinds of knowledge, different backgrounds, different experiences. The more you can throw that together, and different skills, of course, the more likely you are to solve the problem.
Right. So sticking with these diverse personalities, one of the most colorful settings in your book, the scenes in your book, is room 40 of the old Admiralty building at Whitehall, which was the home base for codebreakers during World War I. Can you tell us about who was there, and also maybe what more modern organizations might be able to learn from those people?
Yeah, so it's a great example, and it is really where GCHQ began back in 1914-18, the First War, and similar things were happening in the US at the same time with some equally eccentric people, to be honest. But what happened was they drew together, faced with all these encrypted messages that were coming across telegraph cables, pre-internet in those days. They drew together people with language skills who seemed to have some kind of background that might be useful. They really didn't know who they needed. And they drew these together. And of course, a lot of particularly young men had got off to fight. So it was partly who they were left with. And they put these together, and they did have an amazing success rate in the First World War. But there are some real standout eccentrics. And then the one I picked out in the book is a man called Dilly Knox, who was a very famous classicist, Latin and Greek scholar, and a number of things that are strange about him. But one was that he loved to work in the bath. So he did his best thinking in the bath, and he had a bath installed in the Admiralty building in the office next to him, so that you could sit in it for much of the day. That's hard to imagine in a modern government department, but or even an Admiralty in Washington or London. But then when he moved to Bletchley as a slightly older man, he sat in a bath for much of the day, to the point where one of his colleagues thought he'd drowned and broke the door down. So this wasn't an affectation. He says in one of his letters, this aided with the perception of analogies. And we don't quite know what that means, but we think it sounds like it helped him make connections. And there's a lot of neurological research now which shows that sitting in warm water does do something to the brain, and it does something around the release of neurons and serotonin. And there is now good scientific evidence for suggesting that he was onto something. So the other lessons for us, well, clearly for employers who want to encourage and support neurodiverse people, we can't do everything. We can't install baths everywhere. But taking seriously the needs of people with those differences and helping them thrive, really, help to get the best from them is something takes quite a lot of effort and time for management. So there are some lessons for us, I think.
When you take a sip of an ice-cold Coke Zero Sugar, you know you're getting real Coca-Cola taste you love. And with zero sugar. It's so delicious, you can almost taste it with your ears. Hear those bubbles? Imagine them tingling on your tongue. Fizzy deliciousness. Listen to that cascading liquid. It's unmistakably tasty. All with zero sugar. Crisp. Refreshing. And ice cold. Ah. Coke Zero Sugar. Real Coca-Cola taste. Zero sugar.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number, 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number, save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
There are also a lot of anecdotes in the book about people putting on pantomimes and playing poker and just generally seeming to have a pretty good time. And I think intellectually, a lot of business leaders know that teams that are playful are somewhat more productive. I think that's why there's that cliche about startups having ping pong tables.
Yes.
At Bletchley, though, how much do you think this kind of office culture, quote unquote, actually helped them to do the job?
I think it's a great point, and you're right that we've kind of systematized it now. We talk about work-life balance, or we have the sandpit or the ping pong table in a big tech company. I think they were doing it naturally. Partly it was wartime. They had their very long shifts. They worked really hard, but they then had time off, and they were really confined to Bletchley. They had most of the time. So they made their own entertainment. But I think you're absolutely right. There's something in the creativity that comes from that. And there's something very special about the intelligence world, and you'll know this better than anyone from your podcasts, because it's all about this. But because you can't take your work home, there's no way you can take most of your work home. It's too secret. You can't work remotely most of the time from home. You have to stop at the time that your shift stops, and you have to go and do something else. Now, you can carry on thinking about the problem, especially if you're, say, a mathematician. But there's a much clearer break between work and life. And you can't discuss what you're doing with your family and friends outside work. You can't go down to the pub and chat about what you did today. And one of the effects of that, I think, is people are able to leave their work at work. And it's really remarkable, not just at Bletchley, but in modern day agencies, including GCHQ, the incredible range of outside hobbies pursued to a huge degree. So not just the puzzling, but sports, and particularly engineering related sports. So it's kind of motorcycles and automobiles and heavy engineering and Lego building. It's music, because music and maths are very related. You get a lot of great musicians and a great orchestra, a great brass band too, and a great choir in Bletchley and in GCHQ. So you get these incredible hobbies. And some of these people, like Joan Clark, who was famous as Alan Turing's fiancée for a while, but worked with him and played by Keira Knightley in The Imitation Game, for those who've seen it. She is most famous in the outside world as an expert on the gold coinage of King James II. So she had a passionate hobby, completely unrelated really to work. But I think, to get back to your original point, all that creativity and what we would call hobbies somehow feeds into the real work of puzzle solving. And I think we don't quite understand how that happens, but we know when we see it.
And you mentioned neurodiversity. Of course, it wouldn't be called the same thing at the time. But as you point out in the book, Bletchley Park wasn't actively recruiting neurodiverse candidates. But so why would you say that so many of them ended up working there?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it's wrong to hold up Bletchley as a kind of example of modern diversity, because it was diverse for its time, definitely. The UK was a much less diverse place then. But nobody set out with a diversity program. Nobody had a list of quotas. It happened because, well, for two reasons, really. One is a lot of people had gone off to fight, and so who were you left with? And that was predominantly women, of course. So 75% of the employees at Bletchley were women. Really important, and has some big lessons actually for computer science, but we might come back to that. The second reason why you had a lot of neurodiverse staff was they were looking for people who could do these really difficult things. So, for example, they set a test that if you could do the Daily Telegraph newspaper crossword puzzle in under 12 minutes, you would be privately approached. And what you were like, whether you fitted in, whether you conformed to the organization, was completely secondary. And so I think the key for Bletchley, and they carried that through to GCHQ, was tolerance of difference. So what you want is somebody who's really good at what they do and is the right fit for that task. The fact that they may have all sorts of other eccentricities, as you see it, or difficulties, or need a lot of care and support, is secondary. So the management of Bletchley were very good at being tolerant, in short. They didn't really worry too much about people's personal lives or their interests. They were focused on getting the best people for the job.
And you make the point, and I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about it now, that recruiting sort of required a bit of risk-taking of its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there were risks in every way. You didn't quite know what you needed at that stage to solve this very difficult problem of highly encrypted traffic on a massive scale flowing around the world from the Axis powers from Germany and Japan at that time. It wasn't really clear what skills were needed. There was a sense that we probably needed more maths than linguists that we'd had in the First World War. So mathematicians and machines were going to be more important. And of course, out of that came the invention of the world's first digital programmable computer at Bletchley, which was a kind of byproduct of solving the problem. But you didn't really know who you were trying to recruit, so you couldn't go out with a clear advert. And you were kind of taking a mixture of what you could get, people who seemed to have some relevant aptitude or experience, and then seeing what worked. And of course, because it was so secret, you had to employ people that you weren't going to be able to let go for the duration of the war, really. It was going to be quite hard to let them go because it was so precious, this knowledge that Britain was breaking German codes routinely, that you had to manage those difficulties and find ways of solving difficulties in performance.
One of the parts of the book that I find most fascinating is when you talk about the role of agencies in what you call the secret world to challenge the idealism that comes with advances in technology. And you talk about the need to kind of investigate the possibly nefarious uses of these new tools that all of us have access to. So I'm curious if over the course of your career, you feel that you've gained more people on your side when it comes to being skeptical of this kind of techno-optimism? You know, are there more people in that questioning role?
I think there are, actually. I mean, no thanks to me, but when I started the job, I remember on the first day, well, I'd been there actually a while, but the first day officially, I did a piece for the Financial Times at the time, and it made a big splash here and in other countries because I was basically saying, and this was the middle of the ISIS terrorism crisis, that the big tech companies were part of the problem and we needed their help, really. And of course, this was post the Edward Snowden crisis, and trust between tech companies and government was at a low point. But I was just making the point that there are serious problems being created by these platforms. And it's not their intention, it's not their fault, but the only way we could solve these issues was with their help. And that was seen as controversial at the time. Now, I think as we look back, everybody is saying the big tech company platforms, particularly social media, have caused all sorts of problems for a whole generation, particularly of young people. Never mind terrorism. We've been engaged in this massive kind of social experiment where we've subjected a generation of young people to exposure to social media on a mass scale and to content which we would not really have wanted them to see, and to addictive algorithms that have really had a huge impact on their lives. And so that's now become a kind of routine point to make. And I think that is an example of where it is the job of agencies, whether law enforcement or in intelligence, to kind of look ahead and see, well, yeah, this technology is great and we're all technologists and we love using it, but how could it be misused in the future? And you don't get that from the companies themselves for two reasons. One is they tend to be idealistic when they start, but also, of course, they're driven by profit and by shareholder value. That's their reason for existing. So you can't blame them for that. It's a commercial venture for them. And so the damage is being done partly by that business model. And it's up to governments and for agencies to say, well, hang on, there's a downside to all of this. And don't we need to kind of step back and maybe regulate? And so I think, yeah, that's a natural thing for an agency like GCHQ to do, because we're supposed to be there to stop bad things happening to the country, to counter people who are trying to do damage. And many of them will be using the technologies that the rest of us use, but they're using them for bad motives.
Yeah, I don't suppose you're envious of your colleagues who are still working in the government to unpick some of these problems.
No, I think it's a really, really tough, particularly regulation around the big tech companies and social media is a very tough problem. And it's a geopolitical problem because, of course, they are predominantly US based and all other countries are using them. So it's a real challenge. I think things have probably got a little bit better on cooperation on things like terrorism. That's settled down a bit. on child abuse, on those sorts of things where kind of everybody agrees that these are areas where we need to work together. But for everything else, it's a very tough challenge, I think.
Well, along these lines, I'd like to ask you, towards the end of the book, you write about the contradictory leadership styles of people in commercial technology versus those at Bletchley Park and within this world of secrets. Could you say a bit about the difference between leaders in these two camps, all of whom are working with technology and patterns and codes?
Yeah, I think it's a great point because there's some overlap, obviously, as you say. There are many people in both worlds, commercial and government, in signals intelligence, especially in the technical agencies, who could have worked in either, I guess, and have the same interests and skills, interest in engineering, interest in computing as it now is. So what's the difference? I guess a couple of big differences. One is in government, it's really about mission and motivation. It's about trying to make things better. It's not about money because, frankly, you're not going to be paid as much or earn as much in the government. So that is quite a big difference. And then I think the issues are often the same. It's about people and deploying the right people. It's about money. But in government, you have a set amount of money you're given to try to work with. In the private sector, obviously, it's about creating shareholder value and attracting investment and growing in that way. So they're two very different preoccupations. But I think the interest in technology is the same. And certainly I've had in the past very good conversations and good relationships actually with people in the tech sector outside of government. And now I'm sort of in it myself, so I can't criticize really.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
You make a wonderful argument in the book for what we would now call diverse teams, and also for allowing individuals this time and space to solve problems in creative ways. But of course, we're living in an era when many of us operate within systems that might pay lip service to those values, but don't actually create circumstances that foster creative thinking. So I wonder what you would think it might take to begin to remove the barriers to access to those resources and access to rest and freedom from stress and, all of those elements for creative thinking that we see at play in your book.
I think that's a really great question, and I'm not completely sure what the answer is. I think in the end, it takes a leadership to make that happen. So you were talking earlier about neurodiversity and the tolerance of individuals who sometimes can be difficult as well as brilliant. And I think it took courage, particularly in Bletchley Park, for the leadership to kind of fend off all those from London especially. Bletchley is a good way outside London, but those who would come down and criticize and say, look, all these people, they look disheveled, they're not wearing uniform, they call each other by their first name, which was kind of unheard of in those days. They're too informal. You've got young people talking to senior military, and this is not right. So there were a lot of people saying Bletchley is like an asylum. They actually used that word about it. It's this crazy place. And the job of the leadership in a way was to protect them and say, actually, they're doing a brilliant job. Let them get on with it, and to kind of build a wall around that. So I think in the end, it has to come from the top. And you're right, it's easy to pay lip service and say, well, we value every employee and we value neurodiversity. But it takes quite a bit of time and effort and investment to actually make that a reality and support those people and get the best out of them. It just doesn't just happen by saying it. But the styles of leadership are interesting. Typically in the tech world, you get a lot of very kind of extrovert tech bros. In the secret world, Bletchley, GCHQ, even the NSA, first of all, a lot more women. And secondly, I think quite famously introverted organizations. So a higher proportion of introverts in the signals intelligence world than in other organizations. And leaders who probably don't really want to lead. So reluctant leaders, I would call them. People who'd much rather be off doing the work they really enjoy, but kind of understand that somebody has to do that leadership role, but can't wait to get back to what they really love doing. And there's something about that. And of course, being secret, you're not going to be in front of Time magazine. You're not going to be kind of celebrating your success. So there's a humility that goes with that leadership, that no one is actually going to know when you were successful, really. And so there's not a lot of point in doing a lot of the kind of posturing that goes on in corporate leadership, because, it's not going to do you any good, and it's not going to do the organization any good, because nobody's going to know. It's secret. And I think that does change the culture. Now, some of that's transferable to the outside world, but not all of it.
Okay, I have an indulgent question for you. The book is so rich with stories and anecdotes, and I wonder if there's one that sort of rises to the top for you as like a discovery in putting this book together. Like, what a great story.
I think you're right, there are lots of great stories in this world. And there are lots of great modern stories, which unfortunately I couldn't tell because they're about people who are still in the intelligence world. But probably my favorite story, which may or may not be true, is about Bletchley recruitment again. And the story goes, the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of War as it was then, put out an advert saying that anybody with experience of cryptograms, so puzzles and cryptography, should report for duty, except that somebody made a typo, a typographical error, and they put out a message saying anyone with experience of cryptograms. Cryptograms, as I'm sure all your listeners know, nothing to do with codes and code breaking. They're a kind of algae. They're seaweed, basically. And the story goes that this message got to an amazing guy called Geoffrey Tandy, who was one of the lead curators at the Natural History Museum in London. He was a world expert on seaweed and on cryptograms. And according to the story, he turned up at Bletchley Park. Because it was so secret and maybe a little bit British, he was too polite to ask why he'd been summoned. They couldn't tell him what the work was anyway. And they were too polite to ask why he'd come. And he spent the rest of the war there. So whether that is true or not, or whether it's a kind of Bletchley joke, he existed. He had a remarkable career. He was one of the people who read T.S. Eliot's poems on cats, on which the musical is based. In fact, it may be his cats that those poems were based on. So he was an amateur dramatist, back to your point about doing theatre in Bletchley. Yes. But he had amazing contribution in that he catalogued, because museum curators are good at cataloguing, this incredible range of military technical terms in German and Japanese. And that was hugely important in his section for the war effort. And allegedly, he was very good at preserving code books that had been rescued from submarines when they were submerged in salt water. So how much of that is true, we don't know. But it's a nice example of the randomness of recruitment. I mean, no HR process could ever have designed that, but he did a very useful job and ran a remarkable section. So I think it's a great story. I mean, I came across some remarkable people, including in modern GCHQ, but it's difficult, of course, to talk about them without revealing who they are.
Yeah. Well, it's remarkable how many famous names from literature and drama show up in this book as well. I mean, the man who's known as Lewis Carroll appears throughout. So you don't necessarily have to be a fan of espionage or code breaking as we think of it to be a sort of a curious reader of this book.
That's true. I mean, Lewis Carroll was a great enthusiast for codes himself, a mathematician himself. He was hugely popular at Bletchley Park, and in Room 40 that you mentioned, they wrote sort of parodies based on him. Harry Potter is hugely popular. So is Tolkien. Tolkien, of course, applied to work at Bletchley and didn't get in. So so there are lots of big names there. Turing himself, people who then went on, like Benenson, to found Amnesty International. So there's an incredible group of people. But also there are all the people whose names we don't know, who did amazing work. And as I say, predominantly women, who were the first computer coders. These were the people who actually worked on the first computer. And unfortunately, a lot of that was lost after the war, but that's kind of a different story. But it was a female organization.
Thank you. It's a rich text. I'm really glad to have you here to talk about it.
Well, thanks very much, Morgan. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between True Spies producer Morgan Childs and Robert Hannigan. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
Porn is everywhere. Millions stream it every day, yet nobody seems to know who really controls the business. I'm Alex Barker. I'm a journalist at the Financial Times. Years ago, my fellow reporter Patricia Nielsen and I started digging into the porn industry to find out how the money flows. And in our new audiobook, The Kink Machine, The Hidden Business of Adult Entertainment, you'll hear our investigation into the power and influence that drives the most taboo corners of the internet. Find The Kink Machine, The Hidden Business of Adult Entertainment at pushkin.fm/audiobooks or at Audible, Spotify, or wherever you get your audiobooks.